from the All Indiana Podcast Network.
It's time for real conversation about the real issues that affect our communities.
Poverty, education, equality, and more.
This is Real Talk.
Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Welcome to Real Talk on the All Indiana Podcast. I am Reverend Charles Harrison, and on this episode, I will be talking with former IMPD Chief Rick Hite, who also served as the Assistant Public Safety Director under Frank Straub. Welcome. This is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison, and I am so honored today to have with me Rick Hite, who is the former chief of IMPD. And when I first met him, he was the Associate Public Safety Director of Indianapolis, and it is certainly an honor to have him as we talk about crime and violence, not just in Indianapolis during his time here in the city, but also what's going on nationally. Rick Hite now lives in Baltimore, and we want to welcome him to the show. Welcome, Chief Hite.
Oh, it's always good to be back home. I mean, I appreciate you, Reverend, and all the outreach you've done and laid a foundation for us in law enforcement. Kudos to you and to the Indianapolis family.
Well, thank you so much for joining. Let's talk a little bit about when we first met. When I first met you, you were brought in as the Assistant Public Safety Director, and you just really reached out to the community, and I got to know you, and we really became good friends. Talk a little bit about when you first got to Indianapolis, and then we can get into all the conversations about crime and violence locally and nationally.
Well, I walked into a situation where at first I said, no, I'm not going. Because until I reached out to you and others in the community, I felt like I was an interloper. I didn't want anybody, even though I grew up in Indiana, I didn't want anybody thinking I came in there with some elixir to fix all the earthly problems. I thought that we could find some commonality. And when I arrived there and had a conversation with you and some other ministers of the community and people in general, I got a sense that you did want help, but you also had your own ideas about how police should engage community. Because at the time I came in, there was an issue with a young man named Brandon Johnson, and there were some concerns about how the police handled that case. And there were several other things on the hopper, and we had a situation involving an officer who had struck some motorcyclists, and at the time, and there were some concerns about that. So I walked into a little bit of a quagmire.
Yes.
To be honest with you. And I had to make sure that I had a conversation with then Public Safety Director about how it is imperative that we have a relationship and a conversation with community, and that we had to allow them to lead that conversation. Because let's face it, today, legitimacy in policing comes from the community. You have to give us somewhat of our marching orders as to what are the core values of the community. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I thought it was a welcoming opportunity for us to begin dialogue. At that time, there were marches and protests, and they brought Reverend Sharpton in and some concerns about the Brandon Johnson incident. So we really came in and we got to meet in the middle of a firestorm, Pastor, more I think about it.
Well, that's true. That is really true. Well, how important in all of your years of working in policing, this relationship between community and law enforcement? Because I do remember there were ministers that took kind of different positions on the Brandon Johnson incident. I think all of us were certainly troubled by what happened, but in how we responded to that, there was certainly different viewpoints among the clergy groups in the city.
You're certainly right, and I think as the old adage goes, don't confuse the methods with the objectives. I think Malcolm was right about that. I think people had different methods, but the same objective. And I think the reality was that I found it necessary that you meet with all the groups to get a perspective of what it is they're looking for and find some common ground. So, yeah, it's very important to have even those who may detract from what you're thinking about engaging in. You have to have that conversation just to get input from all those entities to make a real sound decision. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure community stands with you with the decision we make. So whether sink or swim, we're together. in this process so that we don't end up having finger pointing at the end. We come over with a plan, we execute the plan, and then we reevaluate the plan to see whether or not it's effective.
I really think that, you did a real good job. Sometime I would wonder, why is Hype meeting with that group, but you always felt like it was important to meet with all the different voices in the community, and certainly I commend you. During that time when you were here in Indianapolis, even though we had the bizarre incident, when with the motorcycle, when the officer hit the gentleman on the motorcycle, and the Brandon Johnson incident, it was during a time where Indianapolis was, seeing low levels of homicides or criminal homicides. I think from 2009 to 2012, at least we ended those 4 years under 100 murders. What was going on then? I know when you was in the public safety office prior to you becoming chief, that made the effort of law enforcement and the community so successful.
Well, it was prior to the deep-rooted issue of social media. We were just getting into that social media realm where prior to this whole social media movement, it took about 2 years, a year and a half to 2 years for crimes in particular parts of the country to migrate to the Midwest, whether it be from the West Coast or the East Coast. By through time and attention, it would take maybe before people migrated, or the idea or the theory or the concept of a particular crime would arrive in the Midwest. It would took about a year and a half, 2 years. But somehow along the way, the issue of repeated behaviors or negative behaviors using social media to showcase. We saw the issue with flash mobs. We saw the issue with copycat crimes in other cities starting to pop up on social media. And the craze of being able to showcase, acts in neighborhoods and communities across the country became kind of in the forefront. It became a new thing, a new thrill for young people. And we started to see similar crimes being committed across the country. So at that time, IMPD was basically there's a belief, and there are those who may disagree with me, that in urban cities and certain communities, when you have precursors of education, lack thereof, mental health, substance abuse treatment, and other maladies within that community, there's going to be a natural attrition to the types of crimes that are going to be committed. And you can almost come up with a roundabout number with plus or minus 10 to 20 crimes, or 10 to 20 shootings of homicide for that geographical area. So in a large city, it's not uncommon to have 80 or 100 homicide if you don't have the right dynamics, where people are employed, where you got getting substance treatment, mental health treatment, et cetera, et cetera. If those things are missing, you will have a natural propensity for certain types of violence. And we started to see that, and we started to capture some of that. So, to answer your question, there were things going on nationally we're starting to pick up on, but we also watched the trends among community folk who were not necessarily getting the services. So it was important to have organizations like you and others out there helping us identify those folk who are in need.
How big a problem is that when it comes to certainly, Rick, when it comes to the issue of mental health? I know as a pastor, probably within the last 10 years, there's certainly been more conversation about it within the church community, but I'm not for sure we had much conversation about that. And certainly in the work that I do with 10 Point, it's much more visible on the streets than maybe I was aware of prior to that. But it seems to be a real big issue. And some people think because of the closing of state hospitals that it has exacerbated the problem on the street. What's your thought about that?
I'm a firm believer that has a major portion of it. That when we had in the 1980s, when we had facilities we could get people evaluated in, I think what happened over time when they shut down those facilities, the jails became the mental health facilities, and police became orderlies transporting people to those facilities to get treatment when they go to jail. Let's face it, Pastor. But I think the idea of us, our community has to recognize that for years people were self-medicating saying they were hearing voices. We used to sometimes make light of the fact they were hearing voices, and I'll get a call to our house and they're hearing voices through the wall, or the neighbor next door has some type of force field that's using against them. Those kind of things we didn't pay a whole lot of attention to, but over the years, we recognize that people have had challenges, and sometimes it's generational. Let's face it. And the other times it's substance abuse driven. Sometimes it's driven by trauma. The very trauma and the violence we're talking about in our community is having a negative impact on our mental health. The tertiary trauma, just hearing about a shooting in another area, another part of the country, can have a negative effect, much like 9/11 is a good example of a tertiary trauma event. Many of us weren't there, but we felt as if we were there.
Right.
So then you have reoccurring trauma. If you don't have any intervention, the reoccurring trauma becomes where you actually hear it or you participate in it on multiple times, and each time you hear about an incident or involved in an incident, it takes you back to the original incident. So you're reliving it all over again. So that's part of the challenge for us, is being able to identify people in communities in crisis and how we provide those services jointly.
Let's talk a little bit about your time here in Annapolis as the police chief. And one of the things I've always wanted to ask you, when you look at the violence in Annapolis coming out of Baltimore, where you served for years on the police department and certainly worked with community groups, is there much of a difference in what's driving the violence in a city like Baltimore, which is known for its violence, compared to a city like Annapolis? Prior to probably the last 10 years, we were not on the radar screen, probably nationally, like we are now. As a police officer in both cities, and particularly the police chief here in Indianapolis, what's the difference, or is there any difference in what's driving the violence in the two cities?
Well, that's a very deep question, Pastor. I'm going to try to answer it succinctly as I can. Okay. There's been this need to sensationalize violence going back decades. I mean, we can look at those serial killers and John Wayne Gacy's types and Ted Bundy types, and when you talk about those type of killings, and then we had some situations in Annapolis too over the years where there've been some multiple mass shootings. But I think what's really different now is that people seem to glorify it to the point, whether it be from those who upload it in Facebook. You and I have been on scenes where we're trying to stabilize the scene as fast as we can stabilize it. They're uploading it on social media, and people are coming in droves to the scene. But the other part of it is that we were able to sit down with the media and be able to have real conversation. I remember the brown bag lunches we used to have to be able to explain to media what we're doing and have a real back and forth. But now the media is competing with social media to get that information out there first. Now, let's face it, there's no filters on the social media aspect of reporting crimes or incidents that happen in communities, whereas the media has a deeper responsibility of trying to get it right. But it becomes competing interests sometimes. So what we find, again, like I said before, incidents that happen in other parts of the country are easily uploaded and shared online, and we have a lot of copycat type activity. They see it happening in one area. It's not uncommon to see repetitive actions in the same in your area. The other part of it is that we've had some real conversations about shifting the responsibility of policing with community support. I mean, too many times we've taken on social issues that we need, quite frankly, a community intervention. We are there at the moment it occurred, but you have a long-term history of this that we need to engage you in the process of finding a solution so that we're not overly invested in the problem. We're always looking for a solution. And I think that's part of the problem. We don't recognize that 85% of the people who are arrested come back to the community.
Right.
So we're going to need community support. And we did some things I thought was unique with clergy. We had the Clergy Coalition and I've developed the chaplain program that they went out in the community in the aftermath of the shooting. Within 24 to 48 hours, we had some clergy people out there getting a feel, much like yourself, as to what we can expect in terms of retaliation and what started this in the first place. And many times you and others of the clergy helped us identify, Pastor, long-term issues that we would never gotten to the root of it had we not had your intervention.
So is that different about policing today? Because I remember several incidences where we were on the streets with you and IMPD and trying to figure out what happened and calming the crowd and family members so that it wouldn't explode more. I didn't realize that until I started really getting out there, the difficulty and the challenge sometimes police would have, on the scene of a homicide or a shooting.
Well, I appreciate that, Pastor, but I think I learned from you, because the idea was it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's not a glorified job. You have to be there. You have to be willing to spend time in the community when nothing's happening. I call it putting chips in the bank of trust.
Right.
And going out there and going to the funerals with those who've been shot by the police. And you go to the funerals of those who've been shot by other persons in the community. You went to the family home when the officer shot by the police, and you went to the family home when someone shot by a citizen. So you made it very clear that you cared enough to be invested and go there. I went to over 150 funerals. I spent time going to the wakes, to the repasts, and we spent time in the neighborhood in the aftermath of the shooting to have a discussion with those folks and what the impact was on the community. So you got to take time to build the trust. So when you show up, when a crisis occurs, people are not afraid to talk to you. And it takes time to do that, but you have to be willing to do that. And you have to have those social media networks and people paying attention and reaching out to them on social media as well. And in the aftermath of COVID, it becomes very important to make sure we have a social media connection and community engagement model that people feel comfortable utilizing.
One of the things, and one of the reasons I asked that question, Rick, concerning a place like Baltimore and Indianapolis, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I had an opportunity to visit Baltimore with clergy from several states and meeting with clergy about possibly doing a kind of a 10-point model through the church. But what struck me coming from the Midwest, I think I was in the Sandusky neighborhood in Baltimore.
Sandtown, Winchester.
Sandtown, Winchester. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I was struck by how visible the gangs were and the drug trafficking, sometimes not too far from where police were, who were, kind of out in the neighborhood. And I wasn't used to seeing that kind of visibility of gangs and activity taking place on the street in the open. A little different from what I was used to seeing in Indianapolis. Though we have the little cliques in Indianapolis, I wasn't used to it being that visible like it was in Baltimore. And the clergy that I was with from Baltimore certainly did not feel comfortable walking around with me that day.
Well, Pastor, there was a shift in terms of the economy. Let's face it, on a global issue, that a lot of the things that a lot of the businesses and industry that were in our community, the Midwest, and particularly the Rust Belt cities that had steel industry, we had manufacturing. Much of that was offshored or outsourced overseas. So we started to see a change in our cities. Baltimore was one of those where we relied on Bethlehem Shipyard, Bethlehem Steel. We had Armco Steel. We had American Can. We still have Domino Sugar, but we had industries that were working and that you can pretty much guarantee a young person who graduated from high school who was looking for a job in the 80s could get a job in the steel industry and pretty much be guaranteed a 25-year, retirement at some point. Well, that's shifted. And as we noticed that during the stock market crash in '87 with Black Friday and Black Monday, that there was a conversation about what is going to be the next commodity. So if we moved away from the stock market, there are people who invested in narcotics. And there are people who benefit from those investments. And then we saw a difference around the mid to late 80s in terms of the type of narcotics being sold in Baltimore. Baltimore has always been known as a heroin town. Then it switched to crack cocaine. Prior to that, in 1980, young people were not allowed to be in the game. You had kingpins, and those kingpins made it very clear young people were not welcome in the drug trade. Well, that changed when a young man named Peanut King introduced some heroin, cocaine to those areas, and they utilized motorcycles, and not dirt bikes, but mini bikes and scooters to distribute drugs on the east side. So there was a shift in an understanding of going from a kingpin to being independent operators in our community. So those jobs that normally would have been had in the steel industry and the other manufacturing industry, where some would replace the young people on the corner. And we saw a resurgence of that happening over and over again with the crack cocaine and generational impacts as we see now with kids and having children at an early age, disrupting family. It destroyed the nuclear family as we know it. It became more of a blended family, and the challenges that go along with that. So it's been a lot of things that happened over a period of years. We were never a gang town. We noticed that there are times when gangs from the West Coast would come into town to try to set up shop, and they would be summarily dismissed. But over time, they kind of worked their way in through a back door, so to speak, and found their niche in our community. And it really was more of a survival mode for the gangs in the beginning, that because economically they needed to stay together. But as time went on, and economically meant that we were poor from poor neighborhoods, we need to stay together because we need to generate cash. But then it became more of an enterprise for many of those outsiders. We saw New York boys come into the equation. So it became a New York entity became part of it. So it became a long-term investment in the aspect of young people in communities to the point where we had to recognize that the community had to tell us what values we want to enforce, because it became very muddy as to what we were standing for. Is education important? Is having a decent job and job readiness and training? Are we going to look for mental health treatment for those who go into the institution and come out? Those kind of conversations we had to start having because it was disrupting the commerce of our community and destroying neighborhoods and families.
Well, I think one of the issues today, Chief Height, is this whole debate about what's driving the violence in the Black community in particular. We know communities of color are really impacted by the violence. What's really driving it, and what has driven this violence really for decades, almost all of my life? I have lived and seen violence impacting a community, probably for me as early as the mid-'70s when my brother was killed at the age of 21. Is it drugs? Is it poverty? Is it broken families? You know, it just the debate about what's really driving the violence and how can we as a community wrap our arms around this issue. Certainly mental health has become one of the topics that people are saying that is helping to drive the violence. But it seems to be a lot of things that is driving the violence that seem to be more unique to the Black community, maybe than other communities.
Well, one of the things we talked about earlier was sensationalizing it and making it popular. And we have too many shows and too many opportunities out here to show our community in a different vein. But it seems like the more negative it is, the easier to sell it. I mean, whether it be on social media, people bragging about the crimes they committed and showing violence, and whether it be assaults on other folk in the community. One time we just had some shootings over the weekend where underage kids were in houses and they were shot. And, of course, it automatically goes on social media when something negligent happens like that, either from the persons there or from the media. The other thing I think is important to note is that we look at these communities where people historically have lived and there was a sense of community and value. The question is, what are the values coming out of those communities now? What is the norm? Okay. What's acceptable? It's kind of unusual to see someone watch a 70-year-old woman get beat down, and all you're doing is filming it. You're standing there with a camera, with a video, with a phone, watching a 70-year-old woman or a child be abused, and rather than try to intervene, it's more important for you to upload that, so that you can get some likes. Right. Yes. So in that likes, that means over a period of time, you get enough likes, you get rewarded for that. You see where I'm going? Right. I see where you're going. The TikTok process is full of people trying to make a living off of getting likes and being recognized as an influencer. So we moved from being leaders in our community to being influencers on social media. So I guess the question is to you, Pastor, is who's influencing this? And where is our leadership to challenge those influencers who have the loudest platform because they have the social media and the media in general following them?
Well, I really think Haidt, is what you pose is a good question. As a pastor and religious leader, I'm not for sure that the church today has the same kind of influence on the community that we once had. And certainly if you're not involved in what's going on in your neighborhood as a pastor, then you may not even have a feel for what may be going on around the church that you pastor in the community. So it seems like to me social media, more of our celebrities and certainly the rap and hip hop culture seems to have a greater influence on young people today than the church does. And so how do we address that now when those young families are not in your church today like they once were 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Well, Pastor, I don't know how much time you had to, because this is a new concept I've been processing.
Okay, go ahead.
Year or two. Well, here's the challenge for the church.
Okay.
We've made it very convenient through technology and in particular with the recent COVID challenges we've had for people to stay at home and worship.
Yes, we have.
Through Zoom and WebEx, whatever. So the question is, are you part of a competing interest? It's like changing social media is like old-fashioned TV. You can change on a dime, change channel. The difference is we only had 3 or 4 networks when we were young. Now they have hundreds of different sites they can look at. So the question is, how do we convince them to go to your site of a particular church or religious or community-based program? How do we get them to tune in to our program or to listen to our premises versus with other sites that are more exciting, more convincing, more attractive? That's number one. Number two, can we get them out of the house now into the house of worship? Can we get them back into a church? Because now they've been experiencing working and staying at home. Even those who are supporters can stay at home, worship at home, and offer their tithes and offerings online.
Right.
So how will we ever get them back into brick and mortar walls? And the last thing is making sure we understand that everything that they're about now is activism, visual activism in the streets. Right. We saw it through the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw it through the protests against police. So the question is, are we in competing interests in trying to gain young people's attention to make sure they fully understand the values that we've always adhered to, if that makes sense? Well,
no, it does make a lot of sense. And I would say, yes, we are, whether that's good or bad, we are competing. And that's one of the reasons why I value the work that I do with other clergy and OGs with 10 Point, because it allows us to reach people that we would not have reached and began to try to share our particular core values that we think are important to having a stable and prosperous and peaceful neighborhood. And certainly we are competing with other influences out there that are influencing these young people to go in another direction.
You're absolutely right. And I think, to your credit, there were things were happening in the city where we had flash mobs, for example. We got information that people were meeting at the mall downtown on the 4th floor where they were having problems with, and one of the rationales was there was no security on that top floor, so they felt comfortable enough to send messages out in large numbers to meet at that location. We had some challenges there, but once we identified some of those social media sites and some of the people who were leading that charge, we were able to identify those persons and have some one-on-one conversation with them and their families, and it made a difference. But the idea of following rather than leading and being an influencer is really important for us to have that discussion. What is an influencer, and what is the goal of the influencer? Or to be recognized, to become notable, and in some cases nowadays to be compensated.
Yeah, that's true.
If you get X number of hits, you get compensated for that dollars substantially. So the question is, again, what values do we need to make sure, and what safeguards need to be put in place to make sure our young people understand this can be devastating for you in the long run, and what's in social media lasts forever. And the idea of what taking the best foot forward and putting the right image out there is so important to you, but it doesn't mean you have to act out in order to get attention. And that's what my concern is. As we move forward with technology, will you have to act out to feel like you'll be recognized or be compensated? And acting out means doing something that would garner the attention of millions or thousands, if not millions of people, to get those hits in order to be recognized or become famous. That's what's scary.
Do you think that we are in another cycle of violence in this country, similar to what we saw in the 70s, 80s, and early parts of the 90s, when we were seeing a lot of violence in major cities across the country, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years? We have seen in many cities, like in Annapolis, record-breaking violence. The likes of this city has never seen, but nationally, the numbers seem to be going up. Is the violence more cyclical in this country, or is there something going on today that is different, say, than what we were seeing when we started to see the numbers go down in the 90s?
Well, I guess the question that I would have an answer question with the question, Pastor, a little bit is, how are we resolving disputes? And I'm finding a lot of what we find is street violence, and often attributed to drugs, is often initiated on. So I'm back to social media. A lot of it's unresolved issues, whether it be on social media or in person. So whether we have a process in the courts or in the community that talks about dispute resolution is important. We need to have opportunities to talk about those things, or create multiple calls by law enforcement. We don't necessarily have all the tools, all the answers, because this has been long ongoing, and we may not have the actual root causes in our possession, but the community does. So the idea of can we create a dispute resolution process to be able to get to the root causes of why these things are happening? Because otherwise, we'll end up labeling it as a routine drug dispute or drug deal gone bad, or a targeted crime, or targeted homicide, or a shooting, and leave it at that. But that's not all that's needed, because it's repeat business, and we have retaliation as a result of repeat business, as you know. And having those discussions with family at the time of the shooting, we found that it was easier to identify persons in the family or in the particular support group who's most likely to commit a crime or commit a retaliation type shooting. So those kind of conversations have to happen, where we have a place to discuss these issues, have resolution, and bring forth change. But without that, we're always going to be chasing our tail, guessing at what's obvious to the community, but is missing with law enforcement.
Well, certainly in the work that I do with 10 Point, there's been a dramatic difference on the street. I remember when I started in 1999, we would run into a group of 5 kids, and maybe one kid had a gun. Today, 4 out of those 5, if not all 5 of the young people, have guns now, and they seem to be settling their conflicts with each other with violence. Nobody wants to fight anymore. They pull out the guns, and we have all these interpersonal conflicts that is leading to violence today that I think is different from what was happening maybe 20 years ago, where it may have been more drug related. Today, they're shooting and stabbing each other over a variety of reasons. And how do we get a hold of that? Because I don't think it's a police issue. I think it's a larger society issue, which you have kind of been talking about, that we have to address this issue in the larger society if we want to begin to curb the level of violence that we are seeing disproportionately in communities of color.
Well, I think one of the challenges we have, and it has been always, is unnecessary risk. People who have much to lose don't take unnecessary risk. Would you agree?
Right, I agree.
So therefore, we have to recognize that we have to make people's lives worthwhile and understand the circumstances may be temporary, but it could be life changing in the long run should you make these decisions. And so we have to have it. I believe in the carrot and stick approach, Pastor. I believe that we offer people the opportunity, but we also have to be prepared for those violent offenders and those who make themselves career criminals using violence as a means. We have to send a message to them. And we have to send a strong message. The community is abolishing you or banishing you from the community, much like they did in Babylon. We have to send you to the point, exile you out of the community. But if you're looking for help, the carrot is there for you. And now in cities across the country, because of the monies that were given for COVID and other reasons, there are cities that have more money than they've had ever, if not in lifetime, but probably in a lifetime. I would just say that.
Right.
There are opportunities after opportunities to turn it around, but you simply cannot take advantage of a community for your failure to take advantage of an opportunity.
Well, there's the real discussion and debate about the whole criminal justice system and the need to reform it. And I think most of us would say that there should be some areas of reform. But the concern now is maybe we have gone too far in the other direction. And from law enforcement, many feel like that these repeat violent offenders keep getting arrested and put back out on the streets. And they tend to be either the suspect or the victim of a violent crime. And then the number of them that are being put on the GPS monitoring system, and I can speak for Indianapolis, that doesn't seem to be working. And there are ways to get around that. They have discovered where they're putting aluminum foil around, the ankle bracelet, but they tend to be doing the same things that got them in trouble and arrested in the first place. So how do you look at this whole criminal justice piece, or what law enforcement calls this revolving door of catch and release?
Well, I think the question, we're going back to our original premise. What is the community covenant? What are the values that they are willing to stick to and maintain as a community so they can echo that to the law enforcement? Because our role, when we take offenders off the street, pretty much our role is done.
Okay.
We fail to realize that the criminal justice system is inclusive of the prosecution, right?
Right.
The judges and correction.
Right.
So when they return back to the street, it seems to be law enforcement officers ask the question, well, what are they doing back out here?
Right.
Well, how did they, you know what I mean? So the idea is understanding that the whole message used to come from the community in terms of community impact statements, and making sure there is an opportunity to be heard when you know for a fact that the person has mental health challenges or has a history of deviant behavior. That needs to be shared, because it's not about snitching at that point. It's about corrective measures. Now, everything doesn't require you to go inside a penitentiary to be corrected, but we have to first do an assessment, and including a risk assessment of that person returning back to the community, and prior to going into the institution, you need to evaluate that person, because they will get out. And much like you've done and others have done across the country, within that 190 to 120 days upon release, there needs to be a reevaluation to see where they are mentally, in turn cognitively, and what skill sets are they lacking? What resources are they needing to make them whole? Because returning citizens are, the day before they return to the community, the night before, they had a roof over their head. They had 3 square meals, may not be the best, may not be gourmet, but they had 3 meals, a place to lay their head, and almost no responsibility. So the day you're released, you have to be prepared to put a roof over your head, find 3 squares to eat, and money in your pocket. So how does that happen without community support?
Well, and I think you raise a good point. I think in most of the communities, and I say this in Indianapolis, in the Black community, there seems to be a divide about what the community norm should be for the community. I'm certainly concerned about the low bond, the $500 bond, and people are being automatically released out of jail sometimes before they go before the court, so that the judge can take a look at not just the current reason the person was arrested, but has this person been arrested on multiple occasions for the same kind of violent act, particularly when it comes to domestic violence. And I think that's a concern that many of us have that are on the streets, daily trying to help end this cycle of violence. Certainly, I'm not a proponent of locking everybody up, but I'm certainly concerned that if we are not, making sure that whatever the need of that individual is that is before the court, that if it's not being addressed, that we are putting them back on the street. And to me, in all of my years of working in Indianapolis, that's leading to more and more violence.
You raise a good point, Pat, because here's an example of what you're saying. I remember a case where we had, on many occasions, had to do a risk assessment because we had to relocate people who were either a threat in the community or coming home to the community.
Right. And
he still had unfinished business with the underworld, the street economy.
Right.
Let's face it, that folk who had to learn the hard way that street justice is harsher than criminal justice.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And even though they served their time, you had to make sure that it was understood that there was a risk and reward effect of this, and risk factor says that you're still too hot. In other words, we do low, medium, or high risk. Well, you are super high risk, and the likelihood of you surviving once you release from prison is probably about 2 hours.
Right.
So there had to be an understanding that kind of risk assessment had to be taking place before they're released from jail or released from prison. Now, case in point, we just had a shooting in South Carolina where multiple people were shot in the mall, and the young man who did it was released on $25,000 bail.
Wow.
Now, I asked myself, as I heard this morning, I'm asking myself, was anyone doing a risk assessment to think about the fact that you may have multiple shootings behind this one young man in one shooting, and he's on the street. Those are the kind of things you have to take into consideration when you're making decisions about returning citizens back, even on bail. To your point about the bail process, that's a good example of how you look at it from two standpoints. What's in the best interest of the defendant, but also what's in the best interest of the community.
Yep, that's true. That is so true. Chief Height, our time has gone by so fast. I'm going to have to get you back on this podcast so we can continue this conversation, because we really didn't get a chance to really talk a lot about what's going on in Indianapolis. But I think you really helped get a more national perspective on what's going on. And it's not just in Indianapolis, but what communities and neighborhoods and cities are facing all over the country. So thank you so much for joining me today on Real Talk, and we'll have you back soon.
Thank you, Pastor, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity. But I think community resolution, the dispute resolution court, is going to be needed as an in-between police and community.
All right. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
I am Reverend Charles Harrison, and this has been Real Talk. Join me next time as I bring you more Real Talk about the real issues that affect our community here in Indianapolis and across the country. And next week, I will have a group of 10-point pastors and community leaders with me as we talk about many of the issues that we are facing here in the city, and certainly crime is one of them. But there are a lot of issues that Black churches are trying to deal with that we see are issues that is leading to a lot of the problems that we are facing. So look forward to you joining us next week. Remember to share this podcast on Facebook and Twitter. And this is Reverend Harrison, and I pray that you have a blessed and wonderful day.
This is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast.
And be sure to check out other great podcasts on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
Online now at allindianapodcast.com.